Welcome to The First Turn. I'm your host, Hyena, and today, Llama and I are talking about This Week in Warhammer. If you like what you hear, give us a like, comment, subscribe, or share, or let us know if there's something you'd like to hear us talk about. Alright, let's get to it. Well, welcome to The First Turn. I am Hyena.
I'm Llama.
And today we are talking about, you guessed it, Warhammer.
What?
Particularly Age of Sigmar. There is a new edition coming out.
I didn't know.
And so we are getting some, call it the nitty-gritties about some of the rules details. We're on to our eighth or ninth faction teaser, basically, showing off what some of the army's rules are going to look like for different factions. Some examples of their data sheets. We're getting some, basically some rules commentary about what they were planning in their design phase of each army. It's a mixed bag. I think it's important to note that everything is worse, basically, than it was.
That's probably true.
Right? So when an edition proceeds, new things come out, generally there tends to be basically like the level is increasing every time something new comes out, right? Something that comes out has to be better than everything before it, essentially, in order to make it appealing for you to play over a previous thing, right? So if I get new models for my army, well, they I'm sure better be better than the ones I had.
Buy these expensive toys,
right? Because I need to have a reason to play them over what I used to have. And so when an edition goes on, things creep up and they get better and they get too good, and then the standard for good stats gets better, and then so everything worse than that isn't worth playing. You're looking for things that are better than those really good stats. In the case of Age of Sigmar, it was hit and wound rolls need to be 3s, and you have to have rend on your weapon.
Yep.
In order to even be considered most of the time as any kind of dedicated damage dealing unit, it has to have those stats baked in. So you could have, like, for example, an ogre unit that hit really hard, has a lot of high damage or high rend, has a bucket of attacks, but they hit on 4s. Nope, not worth bringing. They don't hit reliably.
Yep. Which
is insane, right? That the bar is set at 3s, and in order to be better, you have to have 2s. It's like that's there's nowhere to go from there, right? Like, it's insane. That's too good.
No. And if we watched that happen in the sister game in 40K, where there'll be a unit or even an army where people are like, but this thing hits on 4s, and it's like, well, you can't make everything hit on 3s.
Yeah. Blitz 4, nah, not good enough. It's not good enough. And so yes, we run into that issue as an edition goes on. Typically, a new edition release generally resets that. Right. So lots of things get their stats worsened. They might get saves reduced. They might get reworks for the thing, and then in addition to that, get points changes to reflect that, by the way. So a lot of what we're seeing in these faction focuses is faction leaders. We're seeing some of the elites. We're not really seeing much of the chaff units because it's not exciting to see what a basic goblin does. Who cares?
Right.
I don't care about their 4-5 stat line with no special rule. It's not exciting. You want to see what the cream of the crop does. You want to see what your good stuff does. Or in the case of like Skaven and Stormcast, what the starter box is going to come with. That was pretty important to see. But today we saw ogres, ogres, which has always been a feast or famine type of army. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because a lot of their mechanics involve them biting things and eating things and gorging and consuming their foes. They had a bite mechanic where they would do mortal wounds in the combat phase by just chomping on their foes. So a lot of that has been reworked. A lot of it has been normalized. A lot of it's been flattened, right? Because there used to be abilities they had that were just, oh man, you'd spike and it was just ridiculous. I mean, you still have their faction leader technically is still Kragnos, who is the overall destruction faction.
Right, because for some reason they don't have just a named
at all
ogre guy
at all. Besides the underworld warbands, which don't count. They don't have a proper centerpiece kind of guy. I mean, they've got the big fuzzies, right? They've got the Stonehorn and the Thunder Tusk, but there's no named ones. There was a Regiment of Renown before that had a named guy in it, but it was just well, you're a Thunder Tusk. What was it? A Frost Lord on Thunder Tusk with +1 wound. That makes you the named one. It's just not quite the same.
It's a unique model for it.
Exactly. But they did show off Kragnos, which is which was one of those models that when he came out, he was like, I don't know. Is he not good enough? Does he cost too many points? Does he not cost enough points? Because he was such a swingy model. Sometimes he could do nothing. Sometimes he would obliterate an entire enemy army by himself. Yep. It was that kind of thing. So they've toned back him in terms of stats a little bit without, I think, taking away some of the fluff of it. So he still has one of the best charge abilities in the game, which you roll 2 dice. If it's 7, which is the most likely result, a 1 in 6, you get a 7 through the different combinations on 2 dice, if you didn't know. If you get that, nothing happens. But any other combination of dice, you multiply the dice together, and you deal that many mortal wounds to a monster. That's pretty great. That's most of the time, you are taking a significant chunk out of a monster's health bar.
Which, again, reflects how he was described, because one of his stories was he was a dragon hunter.
Right.
He went around and obliterated almost the entire race of dragons.
But if you don't just obliterate something on the charge, he still has a bucket of attacks with high rend, high damage. He still destroys things.
Yep.
Now, the biggest change that they did for him was taking away his inexplicable 2+ save. He had a 2+ save for some reason when he first came out. He is a hairy, naked
centaur.
Giant centaur. Yep. For some reason, he had a 2+ save based. He was I think the first one in the game that had a 2-up save. Nothing else had that. I mean, maybe the Bastiladon might have had one back then, but Annihilators didn't exist. There's a 2-up save Stormcast unit. They came out after him. I think the Khorne Juggernaut Mortal Riders have a 2-up save now in current edition. But there's very few 2+ saves in the game. Kragnos had one. Don't know why. Super weird. You can't remove him with a 1-shot ability. He just takes some mortal wounds instead. He has ignores spells on a 3+ from his shield, which he had before. His ward save was upgraded to a 5 instead of a 6, which lets you negate individual points of damage that you take after you failed your save. But his base save is now a 4 from a 2. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty huge change. But he's also got synergy with all destruction. Now he has an aura that lets you roll an extra dice when charging, and Destruction loves that. Charging. Has always loved that. So with that in mind, ogres had some changes to their abilities to make them a little more reliable, a little more swingy, a little less swingy, but a little less impactful too at the same time. So we've noticed that in this game, this edition that we're seeing, there are not that many mortal wounds. Mortal wounds have really been toned down. I mean, now you've got like a handful of different magical spell attacks that deal mortal wounds. Liberator hammers have mortal damage, but they have very few swings, so it balances out. But like, there's very few mortal wounds which ignore your armor saves altogether. You just take the damage. Ogres get it in spades. Every single time an ogre charges has a chance of doing mortal wounds. Every unit, no matter how big, how small, individual characters, whatever. All ogre and Rhinox, which are like their cavalry, or their what are they called? Their chariot artillery or Rhinox units. All do mortal wound impact damage. So it's like, yes, you're doing less of them because before they had an ability where you roll a number of dice equal to whatever you rolled for your charge, and every like 4+ you do a mortal wound. So some of these monsters were doing like 6 mortal wounds on the charge. Well, that's been toned back because that was egregious. You charge in and like you've got a defensive buffed character on foot, and they're like, I don't care, shoulder check, dead. Kind of ridiculous. Now it's this mechanic that they're using for a lot of things, where you have a chance on a D3 that on a 2+ on the D3 you deal that many mortal wounds. The monsters have a thing where they do +1 extra one. So you either do 0 mortal wounds on a 1 or 2 on a D6 basically, or you roll a 3+ on a D6 and you deal 3 or 4 mortal wounds. So it's like, okay, well that kind of that average, that expected value is pretty reasonable now. That's not bad. 2/3
of the time you can do mortal wounds.
Yeah.
And it makes up for the fact that ogres universally will be outnumbered.
Yeah.
Because they're all big, multi-wound, monstery things. Yep. They're typically outnumbered. They need to do extra damage because every one of them that dies is super impactful.
Yeah. And they are 4-wound models base. They don't have great saves, but they have a big health pool.
Yeah.
They've got a bucket of swings. So like if you compare like a single ogre to a single stormcast, right? He's got twice as many attacks, twice as many wounds. Worse save, admittedly, but twice as many attacks at twice as much damage too. Yeah. So it's like, okay. So in terms of balance, yes, you're trading some of your survivability, right? Because you've got fewer armor, a worse armor save. You save way less, but you put out so much more damage, and you get the offensive. You move faster.
I was going to say they're deceptively fast because their large size lets them. Yeah.
So there are some advantages to it, but in a game like 40K, for example, where there's a lot of shooting, you might say, well, I need the 3-up armor save. Yeah. A 4-up save or a 5-up save isn't good enough. A 5-up save means I just die before I get there. And it's like, well, this isn't AOS, or this is AOS. It's not 40K. There's not a million shots from across the board that are all high AP, high damage, just remove you before you get to do anything. From what we've seen, everything is about 15 inches or less in terms of range. That's charge range, baby. Yep. Like, that's close. That was weird.
Charge range, baby.
New catchphrase, I guess.
That's charge range, baby.
And that's charge range. Yeah. Odd. I don't know about that one. That was right. But like I said, we see a lot shorter ranges now for shooting attacks. Yep. So now, like, a quick moving elite, sort of army can actually get there and outposition your opponent and let them step too close. They don't do enough damage, and you just crush them, right? There are going to be healing mechanics across the board for ogres. They have a built-in one that doesn't require your terrain feature to be alive. Yeah. They basically have a new allegiance ability that mimics their maw pot that just heals the entire army once per game. And then you'll have the maw pot as well, which will probably heal the entire army once per game until you fill it up, and then you can heal again. Right. Yeah, like that kind of mechanic. And then I'm sure there'll be some kind of prayer that allows them to heal guys or something. Yeah, so I'm not worried about ogres. Nope. Right? Their stats were changed a little bit, so the base ogre stat line now is hitting as good as a human, right? Which is a 4+ to hit, but now they wound 2 better. Right. They wound on 2s, basically. Yeah. Which is like, that's a pretty hefty profile.
To represent their strength.
Right. Yep. So I think ogres look fine. Yep. A lot of people were freaking out. I saw it online. I should have read it. Everyone whose army changed a little bit, in any way, is thinking in a vacuum, well, this army now in this current edition would be terrible. And it's like, you know what? I agree with that. Sure. Your army would be terrible. With these changes, this is a massive nerf to your army in the current edition. In third edition, you are absolutely right. It would
probably be bad.
However, everyone is changing. Yep. Right? Like, we're seeing changes for literally every single army that are getting these stats worsened. Everyone's hit and wound stats are getting worse. Yep. Except for maybe something like a Stormcast, who needs to have had better stats than a normal human.
They had this because they suffered the Space Marine problem.
Right. Yeah. Where do you go from 2s? You know what I mean? Like, how do you differentiate something that is already hitting on as good as it can? Like, how do you get better? More attacks? I mean, Custodes did that,
more
right?
Attacks, right, yeah.
Custodes did that for 40K. How do you make a Custodian better than a Space Marine? Would you give him 3 times as many attacks in close combat? Yep. Unnecessary, but okay. But like that's kind of the issue. Is it's like you have a limited number of stats to work with. You can't have everything be you can have the baseline be too high. So I think it's what we're seeing.
You don't want to create so much spiky variance by going with the bigger dice.
Right.
You don't want to suddenly go with a D12 or something. Right. Now it spikes really far.
I think that can absolutely work for other things, but like a boiled down, semi-competitive, board game like this, it's like, I mean, you throw more dice rather than better dice. Right. If you want to make things a little bit better then. Yep. Right? Don't fix the numbers. Like, just let them have more chances. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, what we're seeing a little bit of in terms of look at Lizardmen. Look at a Croxagore who's got 4 attacks or whatever now. You had the rat ogres now are 5 swings.
Yeah, the gorgers. That
is so many swings. Because what's your maximum damage output there? Then it's way higher than your own health pool. Yep. That's nutty. That's where I think you make a thing better. Is you give it more chances. You don't necessarily need to make the stats be more reliable. You could have some things be elite and have fewer swings, but have reliable attacks. It's two sides of a different coin, right? Like, some things, yes, can be reliable with low damage output, but you do that reliably. Some things might just have a lot of chances, but sometimes you do nothing because you miss your 4-ups. Sometimes you hit them all, right? And so it's a different balancing mechanic. And I think as long as you're applying it to the right thing, if it feels right,
yep,
then it can work.
Well, and I don't know if we've seen something that doesn't feel quite right yet.
Right.
Because when they gave us what the new baseline stats will be for generic dorks, and then they're showing us these faction tidbits that reflect it somewhat, but then you can reason it and be like, okay, so yeah, now not everything is 3s. Stuff like this hits like a human, but when it hits, it punches a lot easier and it gets more chances to do damage. But there's fewer of them, but they don't.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you get a worse save, but you're going to be more points. Like we're also missing that key component of how many points are these units going to be, right? Because that's a big part of it. Is it's like are 2 Stormcast Liberators going to cost the same as an Ogre?
And
right, like because it's basically the same number of stats.
And so far, this shows us the stat granularity for infantry that we wish they would have applied at the lower end of 40k,
right?
Where they kept everything like 4s, and then just didn't change.
Yep.
Didn't vary it enough.
I mean, unfortunately, 40k has another issue of the strength versus toughness to balance things out. In addition to the hit roll kind of,
it's a second gate.
It's a second gate. You have to have the right numbers to match up against your opponent's numbers, and so it ends up being like, well, some guns are just objectively better because the special rule plus the strength that they have is just good against multiple things, whereas some other guns might have really low strength, and so they aren't good against anything.
Yeah, And so far in Age of Sigmar, not only do we still have 2/3 of the factions to go, we still haven't had a lot of the keywords defined yet.
Correct.
So we don't even know what some of those do.
I feel like we even saw a new one today. I can't remember what it is, but I feel like we saw a new one, a new keyword that wasn't defined yet. We know that similar to how wizards have a number, priests are going to have a number too. Number also, which I think is going to indicate how powerful of a priest they are and how many spells, prayers they're allowed to chant in a single turn. And so there should be different power levels of different types of mystical, practitioners, right? Like if you were a really powerful priest, you need to be differentiated than having your spell goes off in a lower number. I don't like that. Make me generate more prayer points. Let me chant more than one at a time. Let me do something else besides, that a normal little piddly priest can't do. Let me do something else.
And to that, if you're so good at what you do, whether as a priest or a magician or a general, that you've earned a name that everybody knows, and therefore there can only be one of you,
right?
A legendary or epic hero, as it were. We've so far seen that they're trying to represent that by giving them those named characters super unique rules and pretty powerful loadouts.
It seems like their stats are pretty darn high.
Yeah.
In terms of number of attacks, damage, output, that kind of thing, which I'm really curious to see what a generic version of one would be. Because we saw, for example, the Lumineth, right? Mm-hmm. You saw Avelinor, the Stoneheart King, and we saw the named Wind Fox
tornado thing.
I forget what his name is. Which are I think the Tornado Fox is one of the best things we've seen so far. Even including Nagash, he better. He's so much better than Nagash is. But he's very, very powerful. You want to bring one of him, right? He was an expensive model before, maybe not expensive enough, but he feels powerful. He feels like a unique character should. I don't want that to be the baseline for generic Whirlwind Foxes, though.
Right.
You know what I mean? I don't want all of them to do everything that he has there. I want them to be worse versions. I want him to be differentiated from him by having a higher point cost because he does so much more. That kind of thing is what I want to see.
Yeah, not every Bronze Age warlord is Achilles. Not every Legion general was Caesar. You have to have the generic guy not be they're capable and good and serve a purpose, but the named one is named one for a reason. Yep. There's something about them that's
how many
legendary.
times did we look at Greater Demons, for example, was a really good example of this. In AOS, the Greater Demons that had a name and a generic version were always worse and fewer points than their generic version. Almost every time. Shalaxi was less impactful and less
the
points.
One exception was Scarbrand.
He was more points.
He was 400 points for a while,
but he wasn't as good as a Bloodthirster.
No, in the
you know
list,
what I mean?
the list, especially in 3.0, the list will run 2 to 3 generic bloodthirsters
and 0 Scarbrands.
And 0 Scarbrands.
But not Epidemius. What's his name? The Great and Clean one. It's the same deal.
Rodriguez
wasn't as good as just the normal one with the sword and the bell.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Like, you wanted to bring that dude because he had a really cool aura and he could fight like crazy. And then what did Rodriguez have? He had this staff and like a really kind of greedy spell for himself. Like, he just didn't have as much of an impact on the battlefield as a generic guy did. And so they realized that, and he was like 20 points less than a generic one. I don't want to see that. No. You know what I mean? Like, make them impactful, make them good, make their faction leaders. Make them reflect that. Make them do too much, almost.
Right.
Compared to the normal one. Because I can bring normal ones too. But let me have a reason to bring that guy and then also point him accordingly. Make it so that the point cost isn't doesn't feel bad. Doesn't feel like it's like, well, if I want to bring him, I have to pay these extra points. It's like, no, he's worth it for that. Do that.
Yeah, because he does so much.
Yeah, that's what I want to see. And so for Kragnos, we saw that, where he's got some interactions with destruction in general, which is like huge. I'm sure it'll be great for Ironjaws. Charging on 3 dice seems really good.
Well, and we saw an example of what they said, where those characters might have slightly different war scrolls for the faction, because his at the bottom of this one they showed said Ogre Maw Tribes as a keyword.
Right.
And so there'll be a version of him that'll be for Auric clans or whatever in it. And I wonder if there'll just be one ability that they
maybe
change out. But I think stuff like the charge one will apply no matter what.
Well, nothing else on his war scroll said anything about ogres.
No.
Only his tag at the bottom. And I prophesized. Whoops. I've theorized that it's just so they can adjust the points.
That could be.
Right? So this will be the Ogre Maw Tribes version.
And it'll probably also have to do with like list building, if there's any kind of, or not, because we haven't seen it yet, any sort of allegiance points.
Maybe Ogre Maw Tribes Kragnos has a list of units he can bring for Ogre Maw Tribes. Right. And they define that. And they define how many points he is in Ogre Maw Tribes. But then you've got Gloomspite gets Kragnos, has a different list of units he can bring.
Sons of Behemoth Kragnos. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that's why they differentiate them. I mean, they started doing that with, look at the marked units for Slaves of Darkness. There is a Chaos Spawn. Then there is a Disciples of Tzeentch Chaos Spawn.
Mm-hmm.
Before, those 2 units had the same points values. One just had a Mark of Tzeentch. Well, that made them better. Why was it the same points?
Right.
The Mark of Tzeentch let it do stuff that the other one couldn't in a different army. But then eventually what happened was they changed the war scroll for the Mark of Tzeentch, Disciples of Tzeentch, Chaos Spawn to have just entirely different stats. It was just better than the normal Chaos Spawn, because it was like +1 damage all the time. It had a set number of attacks. It had AP on it. It did other things, but then it went up by 30 points. So like that one was 100 points and the generic one was 70. But it's like, because it was so much better. But they are both the same model, painted differently.
Yep.
So it's like, I wonder if we're going to see something like that. Well, Nagash in this army is too good with this lore or whatever. He's 900 points there. In this one, he's slightly worse because he's got access to different stuff. He's only 800 points in this army. Still Nagash, still basically the same war scroll.
Well, and by putting that faction keyword on that one, exactly. I think that also prevents people from saying, I play Soulblight Gravelords, but the Night Hunts Nagash is cheaper.
Right.
I'm just going to take the Night Hunts one, and it's like, well, I think you might not be able to, because that one says...
And we don't know how allies work either.
We don't.
There may not be a way to bring things that don't have your keyword.
Right.
And so they had to put the keyword on these guys because that's the only way they're allowed to be included.
Which, it's an airtight and very simple way to ensure you don't get weird soup.
Yeah.
Which always happens, because players will always find a way to ally in a better thing, to do best in slots, to pull a term from Diablo, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. BIS. Yep.
Oh man, I hated the BIS list. I mean, a lot of Blizzard games actually have that. A lot of games in general have that. But when a game gets solved and you know what the best in slot is, you focus on just farming that one thing.
Right, because it's like, well, we made these things that are supposed to be for your class that have all this synergy, but people are like, well, I'm not going to play that shoulder pauldron or whatever, because this legendary one that anyone can wear is just better and procs all my stuff.
When you crunch the numbers, it looks like my overall damage output is better with these.
Right.
It's like, oh my god,
my animation speeds up. And, and so in Warhammer we've seen that also, where because that was in 40K for a long time. This edition they sort of curbed it, but you had soup, and no matter what changed, there was a couple players we knew in particular who always found a way to soup.
And did really well with
I'm
it.
gonna ally in everything I can from every army that I'm allowed to. I'm going to break all the rules of list design. And in AOS, you didn't see it as often, but you could still have it. And that was an example I had thought about weeks ago when they talked about some of these characters that can play in both or multiple factions. It's like, well, that's what I don't want to see is if they make like that, the Night Hunts one better than the Soulblight one. And so all the Soulblight players just play the Night Hunts one and there's no penalty.
But what I would like to see is if they go this route, right, where they're like, okay, no more allies, get ally things in, but models are useful in multiple different armies with the same model.
Yep.
You pay different points, you pay, whatever. There's no interactions with the old army it used to have. But in this army, it does this thing.
Yep.
If it was like Chaos Warriors, if like the marked armies all had just like basic Chaos Warriors who had the mark on their war scroll and the faction name on their war scroll so they can actually interact with the abilities. What a great way to like stretch a kit farther. If the new Chaos Warrior kit, it wasn't like, well, I'm going to give a mark and I'm going to bring them in and they're better than Blightlet. It's like, no, they can have a different purpose. They're not an ally or a coalition. They are literally in the book, considered during, book writing time that they're going to be in there and be part of the army. Chosen could be part of that and have a different role entirely. Stuff like that,
But then what do you do with slaves?
They could still have all that stuff. I know, but that's the thing. They can still have all that stuff, but it'll be a different war scroll, different stats entirely, right? Because like some of those armies that like Tzeentch, you don't have a real good mortal presence in your army. What do you have? Acolytes and Zangors? You don't have any armor at all in your entire army.
Nope.
Or if like what is it? Slaanesh. They don't really have an elite infantry. Their elite infantries are just slightly fancy Chaos Warriors. They don't have a hard-hitting... They don't have cavalry. They don't have knights that they can charge into stuff. They've got little slick blade, sleeker, little tiny guys. Yeah, fiends are interesting, but they're not elite. Well, I guess they are kind of, but they're not like... I don't know. It's. I feel like some things can be important in different armies to like fill the gaps that the armies don't have. If they're not going to give them new stuff to fill those roles, they could use some of this stuff in the meantime. I could see that. I don't know. Maybe don't do everything. Maybe Dark Oath is something that is you are Slaves of Darkness exclusive.
Well, because you have
what I mean?
You have humans in each of the other factions already.
Right. So again, I wouldn't want everything to be imported, but maybe select units for each of the marked armies could bring something from Slaves of Darkness in. I mean, we see that in Total War, right? So that kind of crossover where it's some of the rosters get blown.
That's what I was just going to say. Because Warhammer Fantasy already had that.
Yeah.
And they've confirmed Chaos Warriors are going to be in Warhammer Old World.
True.
I don't want it to mirror it, but... And Khorne already has Chaos Warriors that are Khorne.
Yep. So maybe they don't get access to them. They get access to something else. Yeah. I don't know. I could see it. It's like, oh, you don't need them. You don't get Chaos Warriors. You have Blood Warriors. You don't need Chosen. You've got Skull Reapers. You already have those things. Yep. But Slaanesh doesn't. Maybe you get some of these things that you can bring. Maybe, Khorne gets access to... Oh, shit. What do they need? Nothing really. Maybe Khorne's just done. You don't get anything, Khorne.
Well, they got two big waves of models early because they were that first bad guy faction. And though some of it maybe needs an update, they have a pretty heavy roster.
Yeah.
But then we also need the rosters to feel different. Like
that's right.
Because if every army has like the same kind of stuff and then they balanced them against each other and then that becomes the best stuff, then it's chess with like different paint jobs.
However, that gets around allies. But that's the idea.
But getting around allies is fantastic.
Yeah.
Because now, I think it happens because, again, people always look for best in slot. Mm-hmm. But one, I just think you need to eliminate it and own that you've got gaps in your armies.
Okay.
So eliminate the possibility of allies. So you make someone like Gotrek, you make 5 versions of him with different order things, keywords, just like Nagash, just like Kragnos. And then you eliminate allies, but then an army like Fire Slayers is too small. You need to expand the roster. Mm-hmm. And don't do it by letting you can port in Stormcast, why not? Or you can, it's like,
okay.
Yeah. Give them more. But you could do a stopgap for some armies like that.
Because, and I think they did do that. Right? Because what was it? Was it Old Cities of Sigmar? didn't have elite stuff in it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they allowed you to coalition in Stormcast units
Yep.
to be part of your army. They didn't count as allies, but they could like work with the army book, and it worked that way. As soon as say we got an update, they put the kibosh on that. That's gone now. Because they don't need it anymore. The
roster got bigger.
They fixed them. They helped them out. They don't need the Stormcast
aesthetically
supplement.
I don't think I would ever collect to play a Cities of Sigmar army, but all their models just tempt me.
Yeah.
They look so good.
It's a possibility. I'm throwing it out there. I don't want them to do it. Mm-hmm. But we could see something like that because they're setting a little bit of a precedent here some units.
At least with the big time heroes.
Yeah.
And that makes sense for them as leaders of multiple army types.
Zangors was another unit that they had different stats and different rules.
They were in Beast of Chaos
and different point costs in Beasts versus Disciples of Zeech.
Makes you wonder if that was a test bed for that
could
idea.
Be. Yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, most of the army faction previews we've seen have been pretty good. A lot of the armies feel like they should feel in terms of lore, right? Like I said, the ogre one seemed like the one that took the biggest hit, mostly because they weren't doing great before, and then them being nerfed, quote unquote nerfed. I felt like kicking them while they're down a little bit, but the entire edition is going to be redone. Yeah, I think ogres ought to come out and they're going to be just fine.
Yeah, because they're not going to be playing against third edition stuff
with
this new thing.
You got to keep that in your mind and keep remembering.
That's another roster that I'll tell you. I was a little surprised that they kept them and they didn't get Bone Splittered or Beasts in 2025. And the reason I say that is because, like, short of the Gorger unit, which was really a Warcry thing, although I'm glad they're in their proper book, they haven't had much in AOS. They had an offensive army in AOS 1 for a while that was like unkillable Stonehorns, could do stuff turn 1. But they, like, model-wise, you need to AOS them a bit. You need to give us some new. They got a Tyrant on foot.
They got the Tyrant. They got 2 Underworld Warbands, which, again, doesn't count. And they got a Warcry update for the Gorgers.
Yep.
And they did get a new Hunter. They got that Hunter model. Did they get a new Wizard of any kind? I don't think so.
I don't even think the one they have has been updated into plastic.
No. I know the Firebelly, which was good. I like him in 3rd edition. Is still fine cast. Firebelly, like naked fire-breathing ogre. Still fine cast.
Aren't they...
or metal, whatever.
Yetis?
The Yetis are
still
awful.
Fine cast?
Yes. The Yetis needed to be updated decades ago.
Yeah.
They are so bad. But so is the...
Manhunters?
The Manhunters, I think, are still
the Saber Tusks or whatever?
The Saber Tusks, well, so they're different. So the Saber Tusks are the cats, and they are definitely fine cast. The Ninja, Pirate... rolling pin, like all those models of the man-eaters. Yep. Man-eaters, there you go. Are still fine cast or metal.
Yep.
As well. And then they had 2 different butchers that are, I think, still metal and fine cast. You have the one with like the hook hands, pulling the pot, and you've got the one that's just got like a meat tenderizer and like an iron jaw.
Scrag the Slaughterer model.
That was him. That was the hook hand guy. Scrag the Slaughterer. Yep. Yeah, so like they needed updates, and they haven't gotten them yet.
No.
Now their model range is nowhere near as old as some of the other ones. Skaven getting an update makes them fall out of the realm of oldest army.
Oh yeah.
But I think ogres might have taken that place now.
Well, and that could mean they get one. Yep. They might end up with 3 of those kits getting plastic refreshes, some entirely new thing, and of course a character, because everybody always gets a character.
Yep.
But that'd be great for them. Love to see that, because right now their list is pretty slim pickings.
Yep.
And it's hard to get a bunch of those
because you've got
models.
just 3 units on foot with melee, 1 shooting unit, 2 artillery pieces, and then like 2 behemoths with 3 different variants each. 1 unit of cavalry, of elite cavalry, and that's your army. Like I guess you can bring grots. What do they call them? Noblars.
Noblars, yeah.
I guess Noblars are still in the army, but they're like 3rd edition fantasy plastic like the models are literally printed monopose in one piece. Like there's no assembly required. You just cut them out and glue them to a base, and they're done. It's wild.
I'd like to see them get a boost.
Yeah. I want to see what they look like in the new edition, or in the aesthetic. You know, get them some time in the spotlight, because we had some of the stories, which have been very interesting, by the way. If you have not read them all, I would recommend taking an afternoon.
The Dawnbringer stories.
And going and reading those. They are super interesting. There was a story that was being told about, it was like 4 different factions interacting at the same time and to create a weird situation. It was like the undead had created a wine from the blood of the Mortarg of Madness, and they were distributing it in the cities of Sigmar to infect the people with the flesh eater curse. It was intercepted by a chaos lord. No, it was a Lord of Hubris, which is a character from the Slaanesh army, and it was brought to what's Glutos? There you go. It was brought to Glutos in order to bring him down, I think is what it was actually intended for. It was meant to kill him. Well, it had the opposite effect. He went crazy for a little while because he is a master of food. Call him that. He's a master of toxins and gluttony. And so he is more, he's more eat heavy than even like the ogres are, who have an insatiable hunger. Mm-hmm. And so he drank the wine, went crazy and killed some people in his court and was intrigued by it. And so he went and experimented with the wine by distributing it to a band of ogres that followed his like procession around. Because after every battle that they would have, they would let the ogres clean up and just eat everything. So they were like not really mercenaries, but they were like an allied ogre warband army that was like following around the Slaanesh one and kind of was working together with them because of the mutual, benefits. And so he experimented on them and gave them all the wine. They went insane and killed each other. And he's like, interesting. And so like the story was left there where it's like he's going to experiment more with it. But it was like 4 different, armies that were, basically they were saying these 4 are solidly within the AOS lore. They're not going anywhere. And ogres was one of them. And so it's like, well, hopefully that was a case of the ogres are here, not we just killed the last of the ogres in the stories. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because they all did die, unfortunately. But there are more ogres than that, and hopefully they stick around. We saw the city ogre model that was in Cities of Sigmar, and while that was a little eye-rolly that the first real AOS ogre model was not even for the ogres.
Yep.
It at least cements them in the setting, right?
And we had that with a couple of things where it was like the first Lizardmen creations in AOS were models that ended up for Stormcast, and the first things that Grungni made ended up for Stormcast, and they weren't giving them to these factions, but now we've seen that they're keeping them around. So I hope they get a big boost. Plus, one of our buddies plays them. Yep. I think that would.
Well, it's his last army.
Yeah,
because he had Bone Splitters. He had Beasts of Chaos, and then he had Ogres. That was his 3 armies. I guess he still has Sylvaneth, and he's got some Stormcast. But like those were his 3 armies, and 2 of them got sent back to Old World. Yep. This is his last one. And so if they go away, I think he's done. He's like, I'm not going to mess with this. And then all of his Stormcast was all 2nd edition Wizard faction of Stormcast, which are being gotten rid of in a year. Again, they're valid for a year still after the edition comes out.
Yep, and you can use the models for something else, but he got kicked a couple times in a row there, so it was like, man, I hope the ogres get some love.
It was kind of funny, but like I think there is room for them now, right? Because Bone Splitters going away means that there's more room in the ogre or in the destruction line, right? You don't have to worry about this other army now, even them making those models, even though they probably haven't in a while. For the Bone Splitters,
and it's too late to like cut down on the total number of factions in each game. I think they've decided 24 is that number for both games. Yeah. And AOS will, for a time, have less than that next year. But I would rather have fewer robust factions than a whole lot of really thin factions. Right. And so the more time or the more room they make to flesh that out, and we've seen they're willing to do it. There's just a couple of factions they need to give a little more to. Because, we watched both Lizardmen and Skaven were 2 armies that were super outdated. Get big fat releases,
and they kept a lot of the stuff that could stay.
That still holds up.
So Skaven still is going to have their Storm Fiends. They're going to have the Hell Pit Abomination. Older plastic models got ported over from Fantasy, but like the stuff that was clearly out of date is getting updated.
Yeah.
The clan rats look great.
Yep.
I'm sure we'll see new storm vermin. Might even see storm vermin with multiple variants.
And they did.
And I'd love
they
to
did
see that.
Specifically use the word storm vermin in something they were talking about with this game, and so we know at least they're staying.
Maybe storm vermin units with different roles and different
Right.
Weapon loadouts. Maybe you have an elite tanky storm vermin unit that has sword and shield. The other one has the halberd, which they love to give.
Right.
You might see something like that. You might see I don't know, something crazy, like an entirely different type of unit come out of the same kit. Maybe storm vermin are all armored, but then the other unit is like less armored and more offensive. You know, it's something. You know, we don't know.
And there, I still expect there could be something we don't even know coming for them.
Yep.
But
because there are rumors, right?
Yeah.
You can't ignore the rumors when like sometimes they end up being right. You're like, okay,
and sometimes they're pretty specific, and it's like, well, that's
so
weird.
maybe more rumors will be right of the big rumor that we had heard, right? Like there was still, I mean, of the rumors I'd heard, that's only like 40% of the Skaven stuff.
Yeah.
There's like supposed to be a lot more.
And now, I don't think that the order in which they're showing us these faction focuses are necessarily the order we'll see them come out in terms of battle tomes,
right?
Except for Stormcast and Skaven, they'll be first two.
Yeah.
But these other ones we don't know. They're just showing us the factions. Maybe you can guess if you look at, well, which ones feel like they have a really robust set of index rules. Maybe they're going to be waiting longer for a battle tome than ones that are simpler because they know what's coming. But other than that, we have no idea. And there's still so much context. Like I said, we've seen none of the USRs really, Universal Special Rules, really defined.
Right.
And they've only shown us fractions of each.
Yeah, we don't know what the universal stuff looks like. We don't know what universal command abilities look like, universal artifacts, if there's that, if there's command traits, if there's spell lores or generic spells and prayers that we get. Like all this will add to the total picture of like some of these armies where we're like, well, this seems weird. Well, we're missing this stuff. Right? That puts the whole picture together. We don't know what's going to happen in the index if there's going to be more listed. I don't think we're even seeing everything that an army has in terms of rules.
Nope.
There's going to be plenty more stuff, or how the detachments are going to work and what kind of special rules those add to enable it.
Because there's going to be
so what happens? Because what happens if like there's an ogre detachment that says all ogres on foot regenerate a model every turn,
right,
or something, and then you're like, well, now all of a sudden you want to bring big bricks of ogres on foot
instead of a bunch of
and if
fuzzies.
they die, you bring back 4 wounds of guys a turn.
Yeah,
you know, like it could be something like that. We just don't know.
Yeah. Because we have to assume those 4 formations per. Yeah. That's 4 ways to play.
Right.
And yes, there'll be misses where some don't see much play at first, but it'll still give you an idea of what the design studio's thinking.
Yep.
Do you think, by the way, side note, that they should have done the same amount of detachments per army in 40K instead of some armies getting 4 and chaos getting 8? Yeah.
Because it makes it seem like they put more, they care about those factions more.
It does feel like that.
You know, it's like, well, Space Marines get 8, Chaos Space Marines get 8, Votan, you'll get 3. I don't really care about you.
No.
Tau, you can have 4, I guess. Care a little bit more. And it's like, yes, they should have made the same number of detachments for each single one.
I think in the 5 or 6 neighborhood for each would have been perfect.
I agree.
I would rather you had fewer that were really good. Not as low as like 3. That you know, because then it's like, well, are you going to be tanky, fast, or middle? Like,
right.
But like 5 or so per faction would have been really nice.
Yep.
I know they tried with armies like Chaos and Space Marines to represent every Legion or chapter, but that's what you get for writing too many rules for those armies over the years. But for AOS, they're starting off with everybody getting the same.
Yep.
Y'all get 4. Yeah.
Awesome. Love it.
And I know they won't because there's too much pressure to get new releases out. But I would like to see it breathe for a little bit, you know, a few months of letting people figure this out, feeling what it's like. Because list building is going to be, I think, one of the most different things. The armies themselves look like they feel kind of the same to how you're used to that army being played with a couple of new twists. But get people used to the new list building format.
Well, there's also, I mean, we have seen a couple of things that do matter in terms of actual impact on the battlefield when you're playing the game. Like there are... I saw a leak of some of the secondaries, the generic secondaries.
Leaks don't happen.
Yeah, some of the for like the generic secondaries for the first season, and it was you gain for one of the secondaries. You gain points if you're able to kill a battle line unit from the enemy general's detachment, like their retinue. And so it's like, okay, well, that's really impactful. you have to be careful then which units are going into which detachment, because if there's a specific unit who's maybe very squishy or like a small unit that you just plugged into your warlord's detachment because it fit there, well, that might give up victory points when they kill that
Super
thing.
easy to kill it.
So there's going to be some things to think about in terms of building armies. Or if it's like, well, I want to spam this one unit because I like it so much. Well, you don't bring enough characters that can bring that many. Are you actually going to make them auxiliary units and let your opponent get priority to figure out what, let them determine whether they want to go first or not in the turn and dictate the pace of the battle? So I think it's going to be a huge incentive in order to
not spam.
Not spam. Yeah. Because if you do spam, then you could absolutely lose the game or start off with a disadvantage.
Well, and I prefer that. I don't want to say that I don't want players to ever be able to spam, but there should be a cost. And that's like, well, I'm going to spam this unit because it's just mathematically the best. It's like, when there's no penalty for that, it's too easy. But if that's how somebody wants to play, we should offer that option within reason. So then what you do is, well, you're going to give up priority, or you're going to give up easy objective points, or you're going to...
Or I think what they've also done in a sneaky kind of way is when a rule is shared between different units, it will sometimes say your turn once per army.
Yeah.
So like if you wanted to bring, an example they had, you wanted to bring 10 Doom Wheels and a Warlock. You might have 7 of them that are auxiliary Doom Wheels, or 6 of them are auxiliary Doom Wheels. So you ain't going first, or you ain't determining who's going first. Right. But then if you had like more Warp Lightning Zap, it might say one model with this ability, because of once per army, can use this ability per turn.
Yeah, well,
if you got 10 of them, and that's what makes the Doom Wheel good, is using this ability, you've got 9 that can't use the ability because one of them is using it.
But you paid points for them.
So all 9 of them those extra 9 maybe are less efficient.
Yeah.
Because they all can't do it at the same time. So I like that kind of thing. Kind of similar to how they did with stratagems in 40K. Some of the stratagems that they had were too specific per unit.
Yeah.
They should have just been abilities. I'm thinking of Riptides and their Nova Charge, which was a stratagem that you only do on one guy per turn, which is insane to me. And you had to pay for it, points, CPs. It should have just been an ability that they had that maybe you can only do it once per turn. It shouldn't cost you something to do a thing that the thing should be able to do. But there's, for balance purposes, can be a limit to how many times you can do it to balance things out. And so it avoids the spam, which I really like. You may not want to bring too many of this new Stormcast because they all have the Ruination Chamber. And they have a once per turn army-wide negate a non-core ability.
Yep.
Well, you might spam Ruination Chamber and they all can't do it. They all can do it, but only one unit per turn can do it at a time. Yeah. So you might want to like spread out and bring multiple different kinds of units so that you can take advantage of any other once per turn per army kind of abilities across all your models.
Yeah.
So you take more advantage more often. So I don't know. I think it's I would say it's interesting.
And then there's diminishing returns on abilities like that. Like you just the Doom Wheel example you gave is perfect, because while people read that and like, oh, there's going to be some unit that you can just play a bunch of, it's like, yeah, but I think they're going to have abilities like that where it's once per army per turn or once per army per game. Mm-hmm. And so all those extra ones, you paid the points for that ability, but only one of them got to do it.
Right.
Yeah, it's diminishing returns really. And so there's something you have to think about in list building, or you'll play it the first time, and then when you realize you only get to do it once per turn anyway with one of the units, then these other 9 go, well, I'm done with my shooting, go.
You're like, oh man, maybe I didn't want to bring 9, maybe I only wanted to bring 3.
Right.
Or something,
yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit of growing pain, because things are changing, and what kind of models we're going to bring to our armies is going to change.
Yeah, and that's just discerning that from what little information we have.
It's also some designer commentary, right? They specifically said we want units to feel like they're performing the role in which they look like they're intended to perform.
And what a useful thing! Like GW commentary used to be meaningless to me because it was always italics that described the fluff of a thing, and we've seen that creep into some of these rules again. But their designer's commentary and even the videos they do that go alongside these are really useful, because they're using terminology that the players use. Mm-hmm. You can see that they thought about what the players talk about, whether they go around and ask them or they see it in various message boards or whatever. And then they try to put that into there. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be perfect, but what an effort they're trying to make. And they're doing it with the game that you and I have always liked as our 1A. And so I'm super excited still.
Yep. Me too.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm excited. One other thing that I want to touch on is that they said there will be no summoning in the game.
Okay.
Summoning is gone. Summoning is going to be something where you, I guess, similar to when points first came out, you would pay points for units that have them reserved so that you could summon them.
Yeah, they're in a zone not on the board.
Or you would not spend points so that later in the game you could say, I want to summon this unit, and then you would take that unit's cost out of the points you set aside.
Mm-hmm.
Then you put them on the battlefield. Well, I don't like that system because it's like, well, I could have just bought more units instead of putting points aside to do them. I think there could have been a balancing factor there, right? Where it's like, well, a unit is put in a summoning pool. You only pay half of its cost to summon it. Something like that. So there's an incentive to summon units, not just a complete and utter disadvantage to summon.
It's just a deep strike unit is really what it is.
And so units that could deep strike were just better than summoned units because you didn't have to spend time and effort trying to summon them. The deep strike units would just come on the board.
Yeah.
Because you paid for them.
Yeah.
So in this, what it looks like is there will be lots of recursion and replenishment of units as opposed to summoning new units to the board to expand your army above starting.
Now, do we know of other games that do something like that?
I don't know.
Because I tell you what, when they first tried the summoning thing and they sort of paralleled them, I mean, they've had versions of it in Warhammer Fantasy forever. There used to be vampire counts armies that could do 200
You would double your army.
Yeah. And then demons at the end of 7th at 40k, Magnus would turn one summon the Lord of Change, who'd turn one summon a Lord of Change, who'd turn one summon horrors, and like, oh, I've got 3,400 points to your 1,750. This is fair.
Yeah.
And then Termagants were that way. It was like, 5 Termagants all summon a unit of Gaunts this turn. So they just have never been able to figure it out.
Right.
AOS 1, Nagash was that way. You play just him to start on the board, and then he'd go summon 1,000 points of stuff. They've never been able to balance it. And then, like you just said, paying points for it, it's like, well, why don't I just buy the unit then?
Yep. Just put them on the board.
Yeah.
Why even bother summoning them?
So this will be interesting if their way to represent that is on if there's a cost or there's just wound regeneration or health regeneration effectively you can do as an ability. That might end up the most fair way.
Yeah. So with in the Disciples of Tzeentch article, they had talked about it a little bit. Mm-hmm. They said summoning's never been good. We never want to have summoning in the game again. So we're not doing that.
The horrors was what they were trying to show.
So the horror units are now separate. So pinks are separate from blues.
Separate from brimstone.
And brimstones are part of a blue unit.
Okay.
Yeah. They still have that. But what happens is if you got a pink unit next to a blue unit and blue unit models are dead, you can restore them to life when you lose a pink. Otherwise, you spitefully, retaliate against the opponent with your pink if you have no target to restore. Yeah. And so there's but it's not like adding blue models to a blue horror unit.
Right.
It's reviving blue horror models.
Well, and that unit's a great example of how they've never been able to balance it because either pink horrors ended up the best troops in the game.
Yep.
Because they
were effectively 1 wound into 2 wounds into 2 more wounds. There were 5 wound models
that all had shooting attacks, by the way, and that all had ward saves.
Yep.
And so they were the toughest troop. So they had to keep jacking their points cost up.
They were 40 points at one point. It was a unit of 5 pink horrors for 200 points. It's absurd. That's so absurd.
And that's proof they couldn't balance it.
Yeah.
So this way is interesting. It maybe seems a little clunky, but I like that. It's like, well, you have 2 options. If you're out on your own, you get to do a retaliatory mortal damage. If you're next to some blues,
you get to restore some.
Yeah.
It's just like, okay, that seems fair. And they did say that most units that have an ability that lets them come back to life, whether it's summoning them back from grave sites, right, for undead, or rallying a new half-strength unit from your Loon Shrine for Gloomspite gets, they did say that every unit can only recur 1 time. So once a unit dies and it comes back, it's gone. You can't recur the next unit again. You're going to do it 1 time. But Tzeentch has a specific thing where they can bring their Chaos Spawn. And Chaos Spawn, you can start them off the battlefield as summoned units. Mm-hmm. You pay for them. They start in Deep Strike Reserve. You do a thing during the battle and it brings it in, which is kind of a powerful mechanic because it also, when you cast a specific spell that I think all Tzeentch wizards get, it puts a Chaos Spawn in combat with the opponent immediately.
Yeah, which is super good.
But you have to have one ready to go.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if the Chaos Spawn dies...
It's in a silver tower, right? Yeah.
Well, that was a different mechanic, but similar.
Yeah.
They had lots of that kind of thing. But if that Chaos Spawn dies and it goes back into like reserve, basically, in the dead pool, you can summon that guy back again. And then if he dies, you can actually summon him back again. So there's like... Chaos Spawn have the special rule that they can recur as many times as you want to as part of their army special rule. But that's the only unit that can do it, as far as I know.
They're like walking blobs of meat and pasta that
but,
you just keep getting back.
But that's a way to represent, like, well, this unit is summonable, but you had to pay for it. But if it dies, you don't just lose it forever. You can keep summoning it. So you have like 50 points or 100 points or whatever of spawn that you have set aside that you can keep resummoning. So you are paying for summon units, point-wise, but you're also like, it's an unlimited amount of 100 points you can bring back as long as they're dying and coming back. So if they did summoning that way, where you said, like, I have 300 points, you can summon that 300 points back, and once some of that dies, you can keep summoning that pool of stuff over and over again. I think that would be a fine way to have summoning work. But this is a good start. So yeah, I'm... like I said, I pretty much loved everything we've seen so far.
Same.
I know there is some grumbling, there's some griping about their, like I said,
there never won't be.
The army being worse than it was.
Yep.
However, I think it's going to be a much better balanced starting spot for the game than
seems like more variety
than maybe any of the other ones. I know people have complained there's a little bit of flavor lost, but it was flavor for the sake of uniqueness, right? Like there were some things that had flavor that just were so unnecessary and so clunky that I'm glad they got rid of them.
Yep.
You know, like, what did it really do? This special rule that this unit have. What did it really, really do in the game? Make you do extra paperwork. Get rid of it. It's now just mortal wounds, right? Oh, well, the bus of ogres charges and I get to roll. Oh, I rolled good. I rolled an 11. I get to roll 11 dice. Roll my dice. I still need 3 mortal wounds. It's like, okay, why didn't you just do D3 mortal wounds?
Yeah.
You know, like, why are we even bothering with a spiking mechanic when it's just like, okay, just let's speed it up. Take some mortal wounds. There you go. I charge, take some.
Yep.
You know, so I don't know.
Streamlining. Whenever something's streamlined, the first reaction, universal. I shouldn't say that. I don't think most people agree with that noise, but the loudest reaction you'll hear first is flavor loss, and it's not. It's like, no, they streamlined a thing that made no sense. It was like when Ballistic Skills chart went away.
Right. No, it's dumbed down. It's like it's the same thing.
It's the same thing. You just don't have to reference a chart.
Yeah. You can memorize the charts, you don't have to reference it, but it's like, why did you tell me what I hit on? Because it doesn't change anything.
7 minus my ballistic skill.
Yeah, it didn't change anything. Yeah. So anyway, I'm really excited. We're gonna have another episode next week, but we might be changing days after that.
Days might have to change soon. It's fine
to reflect that. But we are definitely on a countdown to 4th. We've got, I think, 2 more weeks ish.
Yeah.
Before we get some real news about probably a release date or whatnot. We're gonna have a couple weeks of Abraxia being on the paint table. Oh yes. Because she's coming out soon. It's a last hurrah for the edition.
She is my dessert for AO3.
She won't see the play table for me. Just because she's not good enough. But she will definitely see the paint table. I'm definitely gonna work on that. Maybe we'll get some photos up of that. Working on that. Some side-by-sides maybe.
Oh yeah,
little competition.
I know. We have one. Our proprietor Moose got a box of color swatches, which has been all the rage on social media.
Sure.
And we're each going to draw one.
Okay.
And then paint one of Tara of Terra Dice, for those who follow her on social media, one of her squig hoppers.
Okay.
In whatever the color swatch is that we draw.
Sounds like a challenge.
Yep.
Sounds very cool though. I'm always terrible with choosing colors. I always fall into the same sort of color palettes. I run into that all the time. Whether it's skin, if it's like metallics, I always kind of fall into the same painting path.
Yep. And
I never really vary much.
It's tough.
And so this,
especially
I think,
when you know how certain paints behave.
I think this will help me at least expand. And it was funny because part of the gimmick here is that we're being handed a model to paint. We don't get to keep it.
No.
She gets to get back.
It goes into her army.
Yeah, it goes into her army. So she used this as a funny way to be like, well, I also want to get my army painted. Yeah. So, but it's a fun challenge, and I'm totally willing to do that for the challenge,
for the fun of it. And it's a small model. The Squig and Git are just tiny models with great features that are exaggerated. Yep. So it's like painting a chibi, really. And we have 2 very different Gloomspite Gits players in our group. We have one, Kendar, who prefers the trolls, like the trogs.
Yep.
And then Tara prefers the squig riding
Yep.
gobos. So that'll be a neat, or I think. Maybe
Yeah,
she likes
I think you're right. I think she likes the weird gribblies.
Yeah, she likes making them pop with color, and so that just shows like that kind of variety needs to be in every army.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff to put on the plate. Abraxia, like I said, she is AOS 3.0 dessert. Even though her rules aren't coming in good, the presentation is beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. You might say that the chef who made her deserves a combination. He needs a star. He needs to he needs to take my my praise
great
back.
Photo for the magazine spread
Absolutely.
of the dessert.
Yeah. Or an Instagram post if you
But forgot to sugar it, so maybe it doesn't taste right.
But speaking of dessert, I could eat.
Get a slice.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed. Check out our new episodes every Friday on Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible, or on Podbean. You can also follow myself and Llama on Instagram for more. We are at Hyena Paints Minis and at Llama Paints Minis. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. And as always, we'll catch you next time.